Rafinesque was, yeah, he was another character. He kind of falls between the gaps of some of these categories of, the eclectics like to claim Rafinesque because Wooster Beach, who is generally recognized as the founder of eclectic medicine. Rafinesque was contemporary with Beach. Beach was more urban, more academic oriented. What Rafinesque did, he was an explorer and discoverer. He liked to go out and investigate in the wilderness, identify new plants, name them, learn from Native Americans their uses, and then apply some of his own experiments and experiences and publish books on the issue, and considered himself quite the authority and established himself as such, aside from the fact that classically trained botanists were often in conflict with his opinion regarding some of the classification of plants. And so he was a bit of a renegade, which is typical, as many people in alternative medicine. But at the same time, he contributed greatly to the eclectic movement by acknowledging that style of practice as being appropriate. And the important aspect of eclectic medicine that really distinguished them from the other schools was the incorporation of Native American plants into medical practice. And so Rafinesque fed into that with his investigations and discoveries, and he approved of the eclectics. He ultimately got into trouble for, I believe, practicing medicine without a license because he didn't have actual training as a doctor, and yet published some books on the subject and practiced as such. So in the end, I think he came into conflict with some of the people that he maybe could have worked well with if he hadn't been quite so adamantly independent.
The founder of the Eclectics was a man by the name of Wooster Beach, who went to medical school in New York. So he was educated as a regular physician, and found himself over and over again challenging the practices of his teachers and of orthodox medicine. In particular, he was very much against bleeding, which was very common in the day, and the use of harsh minerals such as mercury. And so he started in I think it was around 1827, he started his own reform school in New York, but found that he was unable to get a charter for it in the state of New York, and but nonetheless was very successful in that school, particularly when the cholera epidemic of 1832 occurred, because here was a pandemic of major proportions arising out of the East and moving through Europe and eventually into the United States, and killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the process. Newspapers and magazines tracked this disease as it was coming out of India and preparing themselves for the devastation. What happens is that Wooster Beach was claimed to be very successful in treating cholera patients, and that too raised his reputation.
Beach was originally was fascinated by herbal medicine. He went to study with a famous root doctor in New Jersey, of all places, Dr. Jacob Tidd. And he shows up, and Tidd looks at him and says, "You're a city boy, go away, I don't want to, don't bother me." But Beach is persistent, and he goes back year after year until Tidd, who's becoming an old man, decides to accept him as apprentice because he needs somebody to help him. And Beach studies with him for several years until he's learned everything that Tidd knows. But he realizes that without a medical degree, and in those days a medical degree was somewhere between 1 and 2 years, people wouldn't take him seriously. So he goes to the New York Medical College, which at the time was one of the best medical colleges in the United States. And he graduates from the New York Medical College, and he opens up a clinic in New York City. This is about 1825. And he's practicing what he basically calls reform practice of medicine.
These were independent-minded Americans who very much wanted to stand on their own using the native indigenous plants with a system of practice that was developed here in this country. And so they really identified with that concept of being new, being American. And so that's kind of how Wooster Beach advertised himself, was as an American system of medicine. And it was, the term eclectic was borrowed from Rafinesque to then later identify that style of practice, which ultimately became centered in Cincinnati. He was the father from the perspective that the one to introduce the idea that, you know, you can borrow different approaches that were outside of the mainstream and incorporate them into a new system of practice. And what distinguished the eclectics from the physiomedicalists initially was their openness to using all and any effective medications as they perceived it, including medicines that had a potential for toxicity. The physiomedicalists eschewed anything that they perceived as poisonous, and that included a lot of the alkaloidal containing herbs, anything like belladonna, aconite, opiates, things that they saw as being very disruptive to the system. They tried to work to create a natural physiologic balance using tonic types of herbs that would support and enhance normal function, as opposed to applying something that was a real powerful medication to attempt to control a body functions. The physiomedicalists and eclectics existed simultaneously within the same geographic region, but had two distinct and in some ways opposing medical philosophies, which was a cause for ultimate conflict and a lot of naysaying from both sides about the practices of the other. So they're distinctive groups that originated around the same time in the same area, but with different emphasis in their style of practice.
They decided they want to open up a college, and they tried to get a charter in New York State, but the politics are not very positive, and they cannot get a charter. Politically, it's just not going to happen. And so he decides that they need to look elsewhere, and they find a school that has basically a charter that's still a valid charter, but the school's no longer functioning out in Ohio, which at this point is the frontier. And he sends one of his lieutenants, Thomas Morrow.
And this was the Reformed Medical College of Worthington, and it was chartered in 1836. It was the first sectarian medical school chartered in the United States. And this medical school lasted about 3 years, I think. And that doesn't sound like much, but in fact it was important, because its demise was not due to its lack of success. Its demise was due to a resurrection riot that occurred. And let me explain the resurrection riot. All of these medical schools had trouble with getting anatomical material, and it was not uncommon for medical students to be advised on coming to a medical school in the early 19th century to bring your own cadaver. And if they didn't, the medical school would work very closely with undertakers in local graveyards to find suitable material. Well, there was a Mrs. Cram who was unclaimed by her family and who had been buried in a potter's field, at least for a few hours, and then she had an untimely resurrection by the faculty and students of Worthington. And when the townspeople, well, I should say the family, came to the grave site and discovered that the grave had been tampered with, they aroused the town people, and the town people marched on the college. They ordered everybody out of the college and then literally destroyed it, fired it and firebombed it and the like. And so they lost their charter, and they moved then to Cincinnati. And there in Cincinnati, they received another charter, and this became the Eclectic Medical Institute that was chartered in 1845. And that school lasted until 1942, when it finally gave up its charter. So it is the longest, it had the longest life of any of the alternative medical schools. And its history has been a rather impressive one over the years.
And the eclectics, who don't become actually known as eclectics until probably close to 1848, are in Cincinnati. They're in other places too, but they do probably better in Cincinnati than anywhere else. That becomes their sort of their home.
In all, there were some 66 eclectic schools created in the 19th century. And most of them were based on forbidding the use of metals, in their medicines, forbidding the use of bleeding. And but what you find over time is that they gravitated toward a certain set of herbal medicines that came out of the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, first with the Merrill and Company pharmacy, and then later with the John Uri Lloyd pharmacy, and their particular brand of specific medicines. The curriculum of almost all of these medical schools tried to reflect that of regular medicine. In other words, they didn't go off completely on their own and just remake their pedagogy. They followed most of the format of regular medical schools, but infused it with their own particular brand or their own particular approach. But they taught anatomy, they had dissections, they had much of what the regular medical school had in its curriculum, only it was their therapeutic aspect that was different. And the same could be said for the eclectics too. When it got to the therapeutics, that's what was fundamentally different in their coursework. And that is why, for example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, when there were licensing exams, it was not the rest of the pedagogy that was a problem. It was the area of therapeutics that was a problem in the licensing. When EMI was established, it had a rocky history during the first half of the 19th century, at least up until the Civil War. The faculty were legendary for their feuds. They were strong individuals and were in any number of feuds, fights, actual fist fights occasionally during the course of that, the early history of the medical college. EMI was a large college by comparison. It was probably the third largest college in the United States at the time. Its classes averaged somewhere in the neighborhood of 230 to 250, which by any standard was high, particularly when you went outside of Philadelphia or New York. One of the early deans of this medical school was Thomas Vaughan Morrow, and he remained dean up until the 1840s. And he tried to keep this group in control, and did so rather successfully, I would say. And then came a fellow by the name of Joseph Rhodes Buchanan. And Buchanan was an unruly type of person. Fought his way. It was not himself a physician, but obtained his degree from a diploma mill. Was very pugnacious and fought with the faculty, but also dominated the faculty. And when he was finally thrown out right before the Civil War, it ended, if you will, probably the most difficult period in EMI's history. That's when they went through all these feuds. And this was a time when the medical school was a proprietary joint stock company. There were some 325 owners of stock. The value of the college was probably in the neighborhood of $14,000. They generated all of their income from tuition and fees, and that amounted to maybe about $3,000 annually. And being a joint stock company, the idea was to give back a percentage to the stock owners. This was not a profitable enterprise, and it was primarily made up of people who believed in the system and therefore did it more as a commitment to reform medicine than to make a buck out of it. But when the Civil War came, the Eclectic Medical School went on hard times.
The vast majority of students who study at the Eclectic Medical College come from the South. Cincinnati is in the north, even though Kentucky's in the south, right across the river. And most young men at this point are enlisting in the Army. They're not going into medical school, so their pool of students, number one, dries up. So that's one of the problems. But additionally, there's another major problem, and that is in the late 1840s, John King, who's a great experimenter, a great physician, and quite a Renaissance man. He writes novels on the emancipation of women. This is in the 1850s, quite a remarkable character. He's also a bit of a chemist. And he's experimenting. He has some tincture of podophyllum, mayapple tincture. And by accident, he drops some of it into a vat of water.
And a precipitate would form in the cold water, which he would then remove and use that as an isolate. And the second herb that he tested in that way was black cohosh. And it so happened that both podophyllum and black cohosh did contain a lot of their activity, most of the therapeutic activity in that resinous fraction. So he was very happy with his results, and from there other people took that concept and started applying it to herbs in which the resinous activity was almost nil, and yet they would advertise these products as concentrates. And it's kind of like today with standardization to a marker substance, which isn't the bioactive compound. So you provide a lot of this marker, and you kind of pretend like that is a standard of excellence when in fact it may be off the mark and a product of poor quality, though of high concentration of a particular component.
And the drug manufacturers of the day say, aha, money, dollars, this is it. We can now, instead of having to take a large amount of a noxious tasting tincture, we can now take tiny, tiny amounts of these eclectic resinoids, and they're much more active. So they've discovered the active constituents in herbs. And they proceed to go through the entire materia medica doing the same process to everything. The problem is this only works for resinous substances. So the vast majority of the substances in the materia medica which are not resinous, this actually doesn't work. It creates inert medicines. Whole books are published on using these things. And for a period from about 1850 to about 1860, it is this craze. It's called the eclectic resinoid craze. And everybody swears by this stuff. They say it's the best thing ever. It's the newest thing. The problem is the eclectics start losing patients because their medicines actually aren't working.
There was also, about that time, what Lloyd described as the elixir craze, which was kind of the old medicine show of some strange formula of herbs, usually with a lot of alcohol and sugar added. It was very uncertain composition and a a lot of strange marketing techniques. And so it really undermined the public's confidence in medicine.
And one other major factor which kind of works toward the downfall of the eclectics is that when the eclectics start, all right, the reform practice starts in 1825, orthodox physicians, allopathic physicians, they're as likely to kill you as cure you. They're doing huge amounts of bleeding, mercury, leeching, antimony, bismuth, arsenic. They're using incredibly toxic substances. By the time we roll around to the 1860s, they're mostly stopped using the really toxic stuff, and they're also not doing all this incredible amounts of bleeding. You know, some of the early cases, when they look at how much blood they took out of George Washington, who had quinsy or putrid sore throat, literally the amount of blood they bled him today would be considered a major medical emergency. So a lot of the things that were driving people into the alternative medical arena were no longer in effect. So all of these things contributed basically to the collapse of eclectic medicine.
And it was at that time that a man by the name of John Milton Scudder took over the college. He was a successful physician, and he bought the stock from the stockholders and became the dean, the owner, the treasurer, and secretary for the school. And from the time of the Civil War until his death in 1888, he held a strong, firm hand over the college. And it was during this time that it had its greatest growth. And by that I mean its faculty were hired by him, fired by him. He culled the faculty and made sure that there were few feuds among them. It was during this time that the faculty wrote a voluminous number of texts, dispensaries and the like, showing the importance of eclectic medicine. And so this was, in fact, one might call it a golden age for eclectic medicine.